does tell us is that it gives us ways for people to be better self-advocates, to be safer in situations, just to make more informed choices.
Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. So to Jason's point in the chat, that is the case. Unfortunately, a lot of times what we learned over the years is that if you have any sort of diagnosis, special learning need, anything that takes you out of the mainstream, a lot of times you don't get access to this curriculum. You don't get access to this education. And so one of the things that TJ and I felt really strongly about over the last 10 years is making sure the families are aware of this. Most families don't even know.
And
so
like in some ways too, because with my, even when I've learned some things about sex and other things, we tend to do it in a heteronormative way because we want to assume that because one marginalized group, we don't want to add other marginalization. So then sometimes we don't talk about things like, asexuality versus being desexualized, or being able to have other sort of ways of sexuality, whether it's being gay or lesbian, or if it's about like how that can sort of working with a partner, maybe
right. And we're not even, that's the thing about that, Jason, is like we're just trying to get people to talk about sex education at all. And there's laws, just so you know, if you go through to the website at the bottom, there's laws that limit each state. Each state has limitations to what they're actually allowed at a public school, what they're actually allowed to teach. There's many that are not allowed to do that. They're not even allowed to talk about those different options when it comes to sexuality. But you're right, it is incredibly important. That's what TJ and I are advocating.
No, I agree.
Sure that people have that access. So what we need to make sure our families know, though, is not to assume, right? So do you think your parents assume that you're getting access to health education? A lot of parents do, because that's a part of the typical curriculum. What we don't know a lot of times is that kids who have a diagnosis, any sort of special learning need, are not included because the teachers are not comfortable including them. They don't know how to present the information to them. And even if they are included, a lot of times we'll have kids that are mainstreamed, right? They're included, but they're not getting access to content that has been modified so that it's not accessible to them. So those are a couple of the different things that we like to focus on when we're trying to educate our families, not to assume that their kids are getting access to this, because a lot of times, unfortunately, that has not been the case, to Jason's point, right? And was that a conversation that was had? A lot of times it's not. It's just an assumption and a choice that was made.
Well, I know there's a lot of things too, like with guardianship and stuff that is sort of to protect, but doesn't necessarily mean, and while the intent is important, it actually makes sometimes people, I think studies have shown that doesn't help somebody build the skills to be able to know what is a harmful situation or what is not, just because you're used to being told what somebody's doing with you. So not knowing what consent is or whatever things makes it harder to be able to say, is this appropriate or not? Because sometimes just with other services and stuff, you're not supposed to say no, or you're not supposed to say.
We're going to talk about all that, Jason.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. We're going to talk about it all.
Yeah, it's a great lead in, Jason. We are actually going to talk about all of those things you just mentioned. So, all right, good. Yeah, no, good points, Jason. Thank you. Okay, so puberty. Again, this is the part I'm going to go through pretty quickly because, again, I'm making some assumptions here that most of you are pretty aware of this. This is a book actually that I just randomly came across. I don't have the book. I haven't read the book, but I found it on Amazon, and so I was looking for an image to use, and this was great. So this book, again, I don't think this is designed for people with disabilities, but it's designed for like younger kids who are just getting into puberty. So this could actually be a fantastic resource. Like I said, I can't speak too much about it because I haven't read it other than the cover. But just looking at the cover, it seems to cover an awful lot of issues. Jason, here up here is your LGBTQ kind of stuff that you mentioned, and the masturbation. It even, that's funny, even includes the word sticky, which is, we won't get too much into that, but that's probably something that's going to come up in some of those classes, right? So puberty in general, we do know just the biological stuff. Again, I think I'm assuming everybody has some understanding of this, but we know that, the physical changes that happen for everybody as we go through puberty, and the hormonal changes, all of those things. There's also the beginning of kind of that identity and kind of developing that sense of self outside of your family and individuality and all of that, that comes along this time. So it can be a challenging, complicated time. And again, think about your own personal experiences or siblings or kids. It's a difficult time for a lot of reasons. But this is just purely the biological stuff. And generally, sorry, back to the puberty slide here. Generally, people with disabilities go through puberty at about the same time, at about the same rate. There are some differences in some specific genetic conditions and things like that, but generally people with any kind of developmental disabilities are gonna go through these issues right along with their peers.
The key is talking to a kid about it and talking before these things start happening, because I just want you to imagine someone who does not have language, who might have more impact cognitively. And I've seen this and I've witnessed it and I've experienced it, where you've got a girl who's nonverbal who starts her period. And I want you to imagine, as a woman, if nobody's talked to you about this, if blood starts gushing out of your vagina, it's terrifying. It's very scary. And it's very hard to teach someone how to respond to that in the moment, right? When you're in that moment of crisis. So I encourage families, I encourage professionals to make sure we're having these conversations with individuals prior to. The same thing, like when a guy's testicles drop, it's the same thing. Like that, those are very concerning things that happen if you don't have the knowledge prior to them happening. So making sure we're having those conversations prior to it. Even if it's embarrassing. I mean, I joke around with my nephew, he's 12, and I'm like, how's the armpit hair coming along? Just like making sure that he's aware that these things are going to happen and that someone's having this conversation with him. And by the way, he has no armpit hair yet. He's waiting impatiently for his first armpit hair.
You know what, Amanda, this is a funny aside. Just last night, my daughter, who was 11, raised her hand up, and it was like, oh, hey, time to maybe take care of that. Anyway, so we digress about armpit hair. The fun of puberty. So one of the really important things, this is kind of a soapbox issue for Amanda and I, hopefully we won't spend too much time on this, but is the importance of hygiene. Because really, we talk about this during puberty, but hygiene is hugely important in puberty. It's hugely important in the development of social relationships and intimate relationships. It's very important in terms of sexuality and relationships and things like that. So hygiene is something that is really important. Again, it's one of those start early, teach often kind of things. That think about bathing, toothbrushing, deodorant, shaving, menstrual care, clean clothes. There's a much longer list, but like Amanda said, think about the example of the girl who had no idea that a period was even a thing, and then it starts. Does she have the appropriate supplies there at school? Does she have a change of clothes if necessary? All those kind of things that we can do to help people just kind of get through those things as they come up. Again, the general hygiene list could be a whole lot longer, but it's important to remember too, especially if there are issues around sensory defensiveness, things like that, that work with an OT or a PT could be really helpful in helping people learn to either to learn the skills or to learn to tolerate things like toothbrushing or shaving or things like that.
And another example of that, if that's okay, with the shower. So I've worked with a lot of kids that have had, some pretty intensive hygiene concerns, and a lot of it is tied to sensory. And it might be the smell of the soap, right? These are things that a parent needs to they become a detective when it comes to this, and they rely on their related service providers and their specialists to help them think about this. But I worked with a kid that really struggled to bathe and to shower, and it was starting to become an issue as he got older. And what his family did, because they're very, solution oriented, is they started playing around with those different aspects. And they found that it was the water pressure and the actual sound and the feeling. So for this kid, when the water was up all the way and the water pressure was turned up all the way, there is a high pitch. Have you ever heard it? Maybe you tuned it out, but there's a high pitched sound And it can be really intense to someone who's got supersonic hearing. And then also he has sensitivity to touch, and the water coming out of the shower head was coming out at such an intensity that it felt like bullets. It felt like nails hitting his skin. So they adjusted the water pressure, and they also put some other accommodations in place, and it was a game changer. I mean, just that was a game changer, right? Jason, your hand's raised.
Yeah, I have a few comments on that because I've had some of these issues myself in some ways, and being able to think about it and what it is that it does, like with showering, a lot of it's a transition and don't loving to get wet until I'm already wet. And then I get really bored with those activities like brushing teeth. And like, so how to sort of prepare, make sure that it's not like all the time, but then also maybe have some music or something I'm interested playing in the background. So it doesn't feel like it's just like this activity of like, what's the point? Sometimes have grounding with scheduling with somebody to remind me, because sometimes I'm like, oh, I want to brush my teeth, and then 5 other things happen in my mind, and then it just never happens. So I agree with you, being able to sort of think about different strategies of like, what is it about the specific thing, and then what is it within the way that that person's brain, or and external factors as well.
And then with hygiene, and you don't have to apologize. I appreciate the input. We both do, but with hygiene tying into goals, you had mentioned this. So I've worked with a lot of high school age boys over the years, and a lot of high school age boys and girls want to be in relationships.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
So for me, sitting down and being like, this is my personal preference, and it's important to have a personal preference and to talk about that. Not everybody cares about breath, and not everybody cares about teeth or cleanliness to say, but I would say I don't want to kiss somebody whose teeth aren't clean. I don't want to kiss somebody who's got bad breath. And that can be motivation for a lot of the kids that we work with. And that's where we see those hygiene changes. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if I'm not getting out and I don't have as much socialization, I have less motivation to want to shower because I'm just by myself in my house and I'm not seeing anybody for months. So what's the point if I smell, because I don't care about how it works for myself. But if I know I want to be around other people and I want to have goals and I'm getting out and I'm getting out more, then I'll be more willing to do it, because then it gets into it isn't just, oh, well, you shower because that's what you say you do, and then the other stuff will come later. It's that this stuff sort of works in tandem of some ways.
Yeah.
Sorry, not to.
No, it's a great point. It's a great point. So just, and then back to the some of this stuff that it's important to keep in mind, for those professionals who may be supporting people with cerebral palsy, spina bifida, any other conditions where people need to use wheelchairs or other kind of supportive equipment. I worked for several years at the Southwest Ohio Developmental Center, which is an adult residential center, a state-run facility out in Claremont County. And at the time, we had about 125 residents. So it's a big place. But one of the things that I realized and became sort of a pet peeve of mine was that the individuals who used wheelchairs, this may sound strange, but think about the hygiene of those wheelchairs. There were some really disgusting wheelchairs. Yeah. People who have trouble eating or feeding, and then the food gets down, and it was bad, and that's not helpful for a person themselves in terms of their personal hygiene if they're sitting in a chair that is dirty or crusted with old food and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of things to think about with this, but some of it is just a matter of just taking the time to notice and then trying to address some of those things.
So when you're talking about puberty, including your doctor, making sure that those conversations are a part of those annual checkups, just make sure that this is something that you start talking about around the age of 8, 9. What should I expect? What should my child expect? Also giving the kid the opportunity to maybe interact with the doctor without the parent. I mean, I was very uncomfortable talking about, my stunted growth when my puberty development in front of my parents, but the doctor would bring it up and I didn't really want to talk about it, but I would have liked to have talked about it with somebody, just not necessarily with my mom and dad in the room with me. So those are other things to consider.
All right. So hopefully I'm sure we've covered everything related to puberty, but that was a quick overview. So jumping into the topic of relationships. And, we do know that unfortunately, adolescents specifically, but it extends into adulthood too, with physical and developmental disabilities, just don't have the number of social opportunities and intimate relationships that other folks do. And it's not for lack of want. They certainly, want to have all of those things, but sometimes the opportunities and the supports and things are just not as available. And when we think about social maturity and how we kind of develop those skills, there's obviously a social skills aspect to it. There's the self-care, so the hygiene stuff comes into play. And then there's the self-esteem piece. And that means kind of a lot of things, but what do people get experience with or exposure to? We'll talk a little bit about opportunities to try things and fail, and what we learn from that. So I think there's all these things that impact our social maturity. And again, I think you can see, even if you've got a couple of these things, pretty solid, if you don't have the others, it's going to crumble at some point, right? You can have great hygiene and good self-esteem, but if you don't know how to talk to somebody, that's going to be a challenge. If you have great social skills, but poor hygiene, again, you're going to have some of those other issues that come up. So it's important to be thinking about these things in a real global way, not just, okay, they've done social skills and we check off that box. There's a whole lot more to it when it comes to really interacting with people.
I would say too, I know one of the critiques of the autistic community, and one of the critiques I have of social skill training sometimes is that it's an artificial situation sometimes, and the actual pressure isn't there because it's a safe space in some ways. And so also being able to go out in the community with somebody and be able to interact with people and then talk about what happened afterwards can be really helpful. Of like, you did this really well, maybe think about this next time, because for some people social skill training might be really helpful to get more familiar with the technique, but for others it might feel like, well, the pressure isn't there, and what with social anxiety is that the anxiety isn't there, which doesn't correspond to what actually happens when it's a live event in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. And I think that's the kind of stuff that you really have to keep in mind, right? So just, yes, we've done social skills at school. You're right. That's not the real world. And it's very, very different for a lot of those reasons. And again, a lot of those situations are pretty controlled and pretty contrived. And that doesn't allow the opportunity to learn from, some strange, unexpected way that some other person acts or reacts. If everybody in the room has a script that they're reading off of, I mean, it's not that that's not useful to some extent, but you've got to kind of take that next step, I think, and really kind of put people in those real situations and experience that, because like Jason said, there's those internal feelings of anxiety and stuff like that. Those are different when you're sitting around with peers reading through a social script or something than they are when you're, walking down a street in Cincinnati or something.
Oh, yeah. When we were doing our last session, our last in-person session with the Down Syndrome Association, we were working with a group of adults with Down syndrome. We focused a lot on talking about when, where, and with whom when we were having these conversations. So you can practice social skills like you guys have said in this isolated, but really we can talk about having a conversation about, how you're mad at your mom and, you want to move out, but is it appropriate to have that conversation in the middle of a church service? Is it appropriate to have that conversation with a stranger, on the bus? Is it appropriate to have that we really had to tweak that out and make sure that we were applying it to different scenarios and talking about when it was appropriate and with whom it was appropriate. So a lot of nuances that can only happen in application. Very difficult to contrive. All
right. So a couple other points on relationships, and I kind of mentioned this, but we know that people with all disabilities generally have an interest in having a social life. If you think about folks maybe on the autism spectrum or something, sometimes there may be specific challenges with understanding body language and the nonverbal stuff that comes along with communication and interaction, understanding intentions, things like that. Understanding some of the physical needs as well. So understanding, how to use your body, how to position yourself, how to, again, all that nonverbal stuff that is subtle and really does need to be taught or at least exposed. People need to be exposed to those things and work through them. Difficulty reading emotions and intentions. And again, this is, I think, Jason, maybe what you were alluding to, the poor social problem solving. You get in those situations, and if it's not a contrived situation, and something goes, something unexpected happens, how do you rebound from that? How do you respond to that? How do you not just fall apart or run away? But how do we do that real quick in the moment, processing, okay, this thing happened, now I have to do something different. And you got to make those decisions in a pretty snap kind of way. And that's not always very easy.
I think you have to have trust in yourself, and that there's trust in the environment. I think a lot of part of this is rewriting old experiences of, you don't get this, or I didn't do this well and people made fun of me, and that people are gonna, not always mean, there's also skills to be learned and stuff. But I think it's also a mix of like, you can figure it out, or you can make a mistake and it's not going to be the end of the world just because of some of those things too. And that it feels like in some ways real life. So even just being out and getting feedback in some ways of, this is what you did really well, and this is just because I think sometimes with the inconsistency of socialization or people coming in and out of your life in some ways, and also seeing other people do different things and you see your life being sort of similar, it can have effects on how you view what you're doing, or if you're able to, or sorry, I don't mean to go on a big diatribe.
Well, that's a good point.
We usually go on the diatribes, Jason. You're stealing my thunder because I've got things to say, and it's specific to that, Jason. So we teach individuals with developmental disabilities perfect social skills, and we expect them to show and demonstrate perfect social skills. And one of the most frustrating things that I've heard from the young adults and the adults that I have interacted with throughout the years is that they sit back and watch all of us screw up on a regular basis. We do not have perfect social skills. We do not demonstrate or model perfect social skills. And yet whenever somebody who has an autism diagnosis, screws up, we're writing a plan. We're developing an IEP goal because that's got to be fixed. But go to Walmart. Go to Walmart on a Saturday morning and tell me how many people are perfectly socially interacting with each other. They're wearing exactly what they should be wearing. Their hygiene is on point. They're, very polite in their interactions with the cashiers and with each other. It's unfair, and it's very frustrating when you're being held to a standard that the rest of the world is not. So I just added to your diatribe, but we got to move on, TJ. Yeah. We're going to run out of time.
All right. So we're going to talk just for a minute, because this is one of those tools that can really be helpful with some of the subtle social stuff. Are you guys familiar with the hidden curriculum? Is that familiar to some of you? I can't see you, so I don't know why I'm asking and looking at my screen. Amanda, it's familiar to Amanda. Good. So the hidden curriculum is a book by, is this Brenda Smith Miles?
Yep, she helps write it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the idea with this is the hidden curriculum items are all of those subtle social things that happen that a lot of people just pick up by just through life. But for a lot of people with different developmental disabilities, some of those things have to be specifically taught. So again, and it's different for all these different factors based on where you are and who you are and all of that. Here's just an example of some of those things. So being a good listener, smiling and looking interested. So for all of you, think about when did you learn, or in what grade, or who taught you that if somebody's talking to you and you don't care what they're saying, that you should still smile and look interested, right? You didn't learn that. That's not like a third grade curriculum item. That's something you just sort of learned through experience. And the learning through experience is sometimes what's harder for people with developmental disabilities. So the hidden curriculum book goes through tons of these real subtle things about, how do you give a compliment? How do you ask about somebody else's interest? Things like flirting and that back and forth that, again, you don't get taught that stuff. And then the last point here is what we've kind of already talked about. How do you recover when something goes wrong? So I can't recommend the hidden curriculum enough. It's a great book. It's a great resource. If you're, as a professional or in training, if you're ever at a point where you're going to be working on teaching social skills, this I think is a must. I think it's really important to incorporate some of this stuff.
We're going
'cause
to
it's
send out a book list to everybody, and it says that it's specific to people with autism and Asperger's, and that is just not the case. I mean, it applies to everyone. Like I said, this is not, we see people make social faux pas on a regular basis, and you're going to see some of those called out in this. So it's a great resource. Recovering when something goes wrong. We're going to get to this at the very end of our presentation, but recovering when something goes wrong, we learn that by screwing up. That's what we do. That's how we learn how to recover a lot of times. We're like, oh my gosh, I just asked that lady if she was pregnant and she wasn't pregnant. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. What do we learn the next time? Anybody? Don't do that.
Don't ask.
Exactly. You just don't ask. You say your hair looks great today, and you just leave it open. And if they want to share that information, but that's what we do. And what ends up happening a lot of times is that somebody comes and swoops in and tries to fix this social situation because this kid has a disability and they don't know how to do it. So I've got to fix it. But unfortunately, a lot of times it is through trial and error that we learn these skills and we learn how to recover when we make these social faux pas.
I have a question, and I did put that in the chat because I know one of the critiques of the autistic and some of other neurodivergent communities is that it feels like it's always up to autistic people and other neurodivergent people to figure out how everybody else works. But it can be tricky because not everybody's authentic, or different things mean different things in some ways. How much of that also is about training and working with people who are neurotypical to also meet us halfway and be able to also learn our sort of sociality? Because you also get autistic spaces now where the social rules are rewritten around what autistic people want, and how those sort of spaces and eye contact isn't 100% necessary. Sometimes you can skip between places because social rules, like you said, is cultures. There can also be disability cultures, and those can be decided by the groups of people who are within those.
It's definitely an evolution. I mean, I've observed an evolution over my career. I know that TJ can probably speak to it as well. And it's not just specific to autism. You look at the hidden curriculum, and I've had experiences before where I'm trying to, I was doing a home visit, and it was to a Japanese family. And, I knocked on the door, and the dad answered the door, and I'm trying to go inside, and he's just standing in front of me. And I'm like, I'm trying to come inside. What is he doing? He's not saying anything. He just keeps looking at me, and he kept looking at me, and he kept looking at me. And finally he nodded at my feet, and I realized he wanted me to take my shoes off, right? So I'm becoming more aware. The world is becoming more aware that we need to be more diverse in our approach to people. So I think this is naturally going to happen, but sometimes, Jason, it takes advocacy. And not everybody's an advocate. Not everybody is an advocate, but I've noticed a change in terms of just how we are educating individuals with exceptionalities. We're not putting as much of a focus on that eye contact piece. We're not putting as much of a focus on, a lot of the more neurotypical, and neurotypical is going to go away. That's just what is happening over time. We are becoming more and more diverse as we evolve. Mm-hmm. So the next thing that I'm going to get into are the stages of relationships. So TJ went into the hidden curriculum, the stages of friendships, the stages of relationships. One of my favorite resources of all times is the Melissa Doobie book. And again, this is something that they, it says, intimate relationships and sexual health for individuals with high functioning autism and related diagnoses. But this is for everybody. There's an actual chapter on dating. I can tell you that throughout the years of actually using this curriculum teaching, there are plenty of neurotypical people sitting in the classroom that I felt like I needed to review some chapters with. And it wasn't the kids with autism or the developmental disabilities. So it's a great curriculum, but it talks about how to move through these stages in a pretty black and white way. And so my suggestion for when we're introducing this kind of curriculum to individuals is that we start with the black and white. We do that with everybody, right? We start with the black and white. Here are the social rules, as we know them right now, because it's very difficult to start with the nuances. You're not going to get anybody who understands. You want to start with the black and white. This is okay. This is not okay. This is safe. This is not safe. This is acceptable, this is not acceptable, whatever language you want to use. And then from there, once there is a comprehension and an understanding, we can talk about nuances. So the examples of this are the stages of friendships. So we're going to talk and give you a couple of examples. The stages of romantic relationships. It talks about how to move from one stage to the next when it's appropriate to move from one stage to the next. So we've had students in the past that, just through proximity and frequency of interactions with someone, they're trying to have a relationship with them. So, I walk past this person every single day on the way to school. She would make the perfect girlfriend. I see her every day. She's always nice. She always says hi to me. That is not what makes a girlfriend. So it's really important to teach to those different stages, talking about moving along the different timelines. This is an example of this as well. So this is a more visual support. We've used this with kids who don't have as high comprehension when it comes to reading, and they use it color-coded. So you can see the different colors. You have a privacy circle all the way out to a stranger circle, and then this is a Pinterest example of how we've taught these skills in the past, right? So if it's a stranger circle, it may be a red circle. If I'm outside of my home or school, if I see someone or lots of people I don't know, these people don't know my mom and dad. These people don't know my name. That's an example of a stranger. And we have to put it in those concrete terms a lot of times. Otherwise, it's abstract. And then with purple circle, it's, I'm alone, I'm by myself, I'm in the bathroom at home. This is a private place. This is a safe place. I can do these specific things. So this is how we teach kids what is an appropriate conversation to have and with whom, but it's also how we teach where it's appropriate to masturbate. And we use this curriculum and these circles to really help shape that behavior. I'm ready for the next slide. So here's the example of stages of friendship. And with this, again, this is the resource you can see up there. That's the book. But you can see that this is concrete, concentric circles. TJ and I, when we've taught this to individuals, we actually put it up on the board. We have written it on a dry erase board. And after we've taught some content, we use it to talk about what's appropriate to talk to with strangers, what's appropriate to talk to with your close friends, your parents. So it's a great resource. And then with the stages of friendships, it'll actually talk about these different circles. So I'm trying to read it on my handout. So with strangers, it says you begin to share information on a superficial level, revealing no personal or private information. If you both respond positively, you may advance to the next circle. It sounds like kind of like a choose your own adventure game, but it's really important, especially when we're teaching kids how to interact with strangers online, right? When we're trying to get them to make sure that they're only sharing information that is going to keep them safe. So
another quick point, just while this book title is up here, and again, we'll have the reference list that Amanda mentioned, but it's important. I don't think we're going to talk about this anyplace else, but it's really important. We always stress this with families, but I think for those of you kind of in training, I think it's also important to know and to share with families that if some of this stuff is enough of a need or an area of focus or challenge for the individual or for the family, these can be IEP goals. You can absolutely have, sexuality curricula and stuff written into IEPs so that it gets done. And a lot of times I think the hesitation is among teachers and others is, well, we don't know how to do this. We don't know how to modify it or how to do whatever. These curricula exist. This one is our favorite, but it is a fully formed curricula. You could, as a parent, you could walk into an IEP meeting and hand the book and say, do this. So it's all inclusive. So I really think it's important that people understand that if this is an area of challenge or specific need, it can absolutely rise to that level of importance in school planning that it becomes one of those IEP goals. And this is a great example of a curriculum for that.
I have a question, and I know, I'm sorry, I have a lot of questions, but one of the things I see, especially working with adults, but I think in other things in my own personal life, is disappointment with friendships or friendships not work. Sometimes when friends disappoint you and being able to do that, or even a natural process of sometimes friends coming in and out of our lives, and that, especially because sometimes the way the systems are set up, especially we think things are forever, we talk about it, or even with staff members and they say you're your friend. I know they don't not mean it, but then they get new jobs and it's like, I'm losing a friend, and like how to deal with that sort of that friendship moving on is not like you're bad or you did something wrong necessarily. Sometimes this just happens, or a lot of times this happens. Sorry, I don't mean to.
No, it's a good point. And what I would say too is in these curriculum, when we talk about those stages and things like that, it's important that we make sure, because the idea is not to teach that everybody starts as a stranger and the goal is to make them deep friends, to use this example. There are people that will always stay strangers. There will people that may become friends and then may go back to being casual acquaintances. So I think that's part of the way this is like individualized in terms of teaching. It's not,
it's not one way.
Picture, right?
Yeah.
And on this picture that the arrow is going right into the middle, but that's not necessarily the goal. You know, it may be that it goes in a little bit, then comes back out or whatever. That's where, you know, it can be adapted for individuals. So you're spot on there, Jason.
I know one of the things that I've had to address on a regular basis is that just to this point again, with the romantic relationship, concentric circles especially, just because, you know, you have a friendship with someone who is the person that you're attracted to and you want to move on to the next level, it doesn't mean that it necessarily has to go on to the next level. So you can stay in the friend zone, whether we like it or not. A lot of times you're going to stay in the friend zone, and that has to be a mutual decision to move on to the next stage. And that is where we get to consent and whatnot. That can be very challenging. When it feels like, well, you're single and I'm single and, you know, we're so close and I want to move on to the next stage, but the other person doesn't want to, right? And they're not interested or they're not ready to. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to move on to the next stage. It has to be a mutual decision. And the other piece too is with romantic relationships, and the circles really don't demonstrate this, but you can go all the way to a deep relationship where you're actually having sex with someone and then break up, and then they're off the circles. They're not a casual acquaintance. They're not a close friend. They're nothing. Like they've left. And that is an area that is very difficult, I've noticed, because there isn't really anybody talking about that. And I think it's because, number one, for years and years, we've assumed that people with disabilities don't get in relationships. They don't have sex. They don't get married. They don't have kids. So it's not been addressed. And we're just at that phase where TJ and I are still walking around trying to tell people, like, yes, people of all abilities want to have relationships, and they want to have sex, and they want to have friendships. Like everybody wants to do this. That now we've got to get to the point where we're like, now how do we help people cope from those breakups? Like those are devastating, you know, and how do you brush yourself off and get back up and try again? So it's something our community needs to do a better job. I mean, we're doing it. We're doing a better job. It just isn't out there and available yet. So the curriculum, TJ, you can go to the next slide. The curriculum that this Doobie curriculum, it gets into really great details about just even places to go to meet. So Jason, you had brought this up before. So when you might have some social anxiety, right? And you are getting ready to go on a date with someone, the recommendation that I make to anyone, I don't care what your diagnosis is like, don't go to a new place with unknown people, unknown smells, unknown paths that you have to go, and you're dealing with a new person that you're trying to impress, and you also don't know where the hell you are, right? So that's not very impressive, and then you're overwhelmed and you're more likely to have a meltdown. It's more likely not to go well. So when you are going on your first date, and if you are aware enough to know that you have that social anxiety, or maybe you're supporting someone and you know that they have social anxiety, be like, let's go somewhere that you're really comfortable with, that you feel confident about, that is going to be the least stress, so that you can focus your energy and your efforts on that person and impressing that person. That's what you need to do. So those are some of the recommendations. So with sensory issues, you want to make sure that you can see clearly, you can hear clearly, you can respond to what the other person is saying. If you're going to a movie and you have intentions of talking to the person, I can tell you, do not take me on a date and talk to me in a movie. I will immediately end that date. I will leave in the middle of I am not kidding you. It is like my trigger. If somebody's talking to me in the middle of a movie, if I can't rewind it, I'm gone. Goodbye. Yeah. So, I mean, everybody has their different preferences, right? And then parties and social events in a group are really nice, just a low stress way for you to interact with somebody without it being all on you when there's other people interacting. And then I just got into an interaction with a former student about this, because I told him that he shouldn't be trying to date people that he works with. And he's like, here are all the people that I know, and like listed, here are all the people I know that are in a relationship or married to somebody that they met at work. And I was like, I know it happens. I understand it happens. But what happens when you break up and you have to keep seeing that person every day? not fun. It's not a good experience a lot of times. So it's just not highly recommended. And that's why it says also not in your neighborhood or other similar places. In bars, this is again where I needed to actually like have a one-on-one session with a social work intern after a class. She had been volunteering in the class and she was asking me why I was telling people in the class not to meet people in bars. She's like, that's how I meet people. I just gave somebody my number this weekend. And I was like, I need you to stop talking. We're going on black and white right now. We're not getting into nuances. I'm not trying to teach these guys who have never been on a date how to pick up someone in a bar and get their phone number. Like that is a huge learning curve, right? You can go to the next slide. So a lot of times our families they're just overwhelmed. I mean, this is an overwhelming topic. And even if a family is confident in, having this interaction with their kids, it doesn't mean their kid is willing to have that interaction with their family. And I can tell you that on a regular basis, my daughter is accosted by me occasionally when I need to just remind her that she is of childbearing age. And I want to make sure that she's got everything that she needs in place, and that she's got birth control, and she doesn't want to have those conversations with me. I really don't want to have those conversations with her either, but I feel like they're necessary to have, right? So it's hard to know where to start a lot of times. This is a really nice checklist. It's in a curriculum. It's a newer curriculum, sexuality and relationship education for children and adolescents. Just leave it there. Just don't put the with autism spectrum. Just leave it there because that's what it's for. And you can see on this checklist, and I'm trying to bring up a bigger version. That's why I'm looking over here. There's a lot of different concepts in here, but this is for a family to go through. And you can say, can the child differentiate between public and private places? Can they differentiate between public and private behaviors? Can they label male and female private body parts? Do they know the different types of touch? Are they aware of the touching rules? Do they have internet safety skills? Like these are things, just a simple yes and no helps a family prioritize, helps us prioritize. Always start with safety first. Care, welfare, and safety. That's what we should always start with. So if you have a kid who's doing something that's unsafe, like touching a woman, touching a lady in their private parts, or maybe they're masturbating in public, or anything that is going to put them in a situation when they get older that could get them in legal trouble or just get them hurt, that's what you focus on first. And then you go to the other skills. You can go to the next one. This is another example of a parents and teenagers survival checklist. And again, this is something that parents can fill out, but also this can be a self-assessment as well. A lot of times we'll actually have the kids here at the school fill one out and the parents fill one out, and that's a nice comparison as well. What do the kids say that they know and they understand versus what the parents say? And this is so much broader. I just screenshot the health and safety pieces. So like home remedies, do they know when to decide to go to the doctor? Do they know how to administer simple medicine? There's all sorts of different skills in the parents and teenagers survival checklist. And you can use this for IEP development. You can use this for treatment plan development. But really with the families, it's nice for them to just know that this at least gives them a starting point. It doesn't feel like a totally overwhelming task to take on. Any questions about relationships and friendships? I know we covered everything we possibly could with relationships and friendships. Now everyone should be fully prepared to go out and support families and individuals. We're going to give you so many resources. We have a really, really long book list that is going to get sent out. So no worries there. TJ, I think you're up.
Yep. So we're going to switch gears a little, talking about just sexuality in general. And I love this. This is the gender unicorn? Is that what it is?
The gender unicorn.
Yeah, We'll talk more about him in a minute, but that was something Amanda found recently that is just a fantastic addition to this. So this is, we've talked about some of these things already, but there's still that kind of old outdated mindset that people with disabilities might be asexual or just sexually naive. Sexually deviant is another concern. And the reality is we know that people especially with kids with developmental disabilities are abused at such a higher rate. And it's really it's awful. Children and adults with developmental disabilities are abused at a much higher rate than people without disabilities. So
in the NPR study, it actually says that adults, it's 7 times higher than typical people.
Yeah. And again, we've said this a few times too, but we know people with disabilities have sexual desires and they're exposed to sexually based materials. They want to have relationships. They want to have all of these things. So we need to work on how we kind of can better support people and better understand the needs and recognize that people with disabilities are sexually mature people, and they just need they may need different levels of support, different types of support, but the needs, the desires, the development, all of that is normal. Parents and professionals can be pessimistic about the potential of their children to have and enjoy relationships. There's that fear we mentioned earlier about if we talk about it, it's going to encourage them to do it. But really the reality again is that talking about it is going to help people make more safe decisions. It's going to help them be better advocates for themselves, and ultimately be able to enjoy the benefits of these things and avoid some of the risks. So it is important that when we talk about sexuality, and this gets some to the sex ed kind of stuff, but I think just in conversation, it's important that people understand the basic biology, the basic reproductive functions, the names of things, and using the scientific names. Again, I think Amanda has different stories, but just, if a 25-year-old guy talks about his pee-pee, that's probably not the best. We need to make sure that people understand their bodies and the functions of their bodies and how they can keep their bodies safe, things like that. So it's really important that we talk about these things in a serious, and by scientific, we don't mean like overly, science-y, but let's use the actual terms for body parts and things like that. Understanding
a girl. I was gonna share a brief story. We had a girl here that was really resisting being in sex education class, and specifically, she had no interest in men and didn't want to know about their physical anatomy and was resisting being taught this. And a lot of it so that we're not setting up individuals to be taken advantage of. So in the Doobie curriculum, again, there's a whole entire page that just has slang terms, because the issue, unfortunately, is that these slang terms have been used to manipulate and to abuse individuals because they don't understand what they're talking about when they're referring to their genitalia in slang terms. And they might call kids or people or individuals names, and somebody doesn't know they're being made fun of because they're using slang terminology. They might talk to each other in their slang terminology, and an individual without that knowledge can be taken advantage of. So it's really important. And again, it's just power. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. Making sure that no matter what your sexual preference, what your gender preference, that you still have access to all the knowledge. Whether or not you're planning on interacting with a penis, you still need to know the penis parts. And there's someone in the chat that was talking about this earlier, and there's plenty of typical people out there that do not fully understand the functions of some of their anatomy, and that's concerning. Like, should you be having sex if you don't actually understand that there's a urethra and a vagina, and that you're not trying to put a penis into the urethra? Like, I feel like that should be a prerequisite, right? So, but again, this is something that we need to improve our overall sex education for everybody, not just for people with a diagnosis.
The other thing on this slide that I'll mention real quick, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about safety, is the concept of public versus private. That's just a hugely important thing to be taught early and often, and around a lot of different things, obviously around sexuality and masturbation, things like that. But there's a whole lot of other things that fit under that public versus private kind of behavior, public versus private things to talk about, stuff like that. So that's a big, important concept. And then Amanda found this little picture of these dolls, which can be a useful way to help ground some of those conversations and talking about biology and anatomy.
Especially if you have someone who doesn't have a lot of language, this is a way for them to be able to receptively or non-verbally point out different things and demonstrate comprehension. So you can have them point out things. You can also demonstrate things. You can use the dolls in a really tangible and concrete way. So it's just another resource.
So sexuality assessment, and this gets back to like kind of what Amanda was showing before, that screenshot and all that. What are the things that people understand? Doing something like this can really be helpful with guiding teaching or curriculum development or skill development or whatever. So like we said, names of body parts, understanding relationships and stages. These are all huge topics, by the way. I don't mean to just gloss over all these. These are all the big issues, but good, bad touch, public, private behavior. This is where the hidden curriculum stuff comes in. Who do we talk with about this stuff? This is where the circles curriculum can be really helpful. If you have questions about something that happens on your body, is that an okay thing to ask the cashier at the grocery store about? No, it's not. So let's come up with a list of people who are appropriate people that you can talk to about some of these things. General safety skills, being responsible, self-advocating, and then Jason mentioned this before, being able to say no. We'll talk more about this when we talk about safety, but I think this is a shift I think that maybe Amanda and I have both seen in our time working in the field is, when I first started, I was working in some like home-based ABA kind of programs. We would have programs that we would run with kids that were just compliance. Are you compliant? And I've seen that shifting, fortunately. There's a place for that, but then there also has to be the ability to say no, the ability to self-advocate. Because if all you ever learn is people in authority or adults or whatever, you just do everything they say, you can see how that can go badly. So it's really an important part of this. Other things that are important to make sure that people understand or get some exposure to, the topic of consent, we'll talk about a little bit more. Menstruation, contraception, pregnancy, childbirth, sexually transmitted illnesses, masturbation, cleanliness, the hygiene around sexuality is important. So again, there's a lot of things to be covered under this umbrella, and we're just sort of listing kind of the highlights. Again, this is where the curricula and stuff are going to be really helpful because they're going to break down each of these broad topics and give you kind of ways to work through those things.
So TJ, you almost stole my thunder, but you reeled yourself in for private versus public, because we have a whole entire slide just on private versus public. And it is so important. I think, like we said, when you're first introducing curriculum, when you're first teaching these concepts, making it as black and white as possible before we get into the different nuances. So private versus public is one of those ways that we can help identify someone with whom and where topics and issues are appropriate, not appropriate to discuss, and also behaviors are appropriate to engage in. So I think one of the major issues that happens, and I oversee programs on a regular basis, and I still have to redirect people because there was a kid in our program that was engaging in some public masturbation, and they were redirected to the student restroom to do that. That is still a public place. We do not want anyone masturbating in a mall restroom. We do not want anyone masturbating in a movie theater restroom. They will be arrested. They will have issues. They might be registered as a sex offender. That is considered a public place. So when we teach private versus public, make sure that you're really making sure you're teaching private versus public, and you're identifying the legal implications. When we have a student who's getting ready to turn 18, that's where our shift focus is what are the behaviors of the activities that we have not yet addressed or that we haven't had the ability to prioritize that are going to be a legal issue when they turn 18. If you're interacting with 12 and 13-year-olds online and you're 18 years old and something goes awry and the interaction is inappropriate, the 18-year-old is going to get in a lot more trouble, right? So it's making sure we're shaping those behaviors with that. So there's different ways to use these circles. If you go to the next slide, TJ, it'll actually, yeah. So again, with the inner circle being the most private and the outer circle being the most public. So you can use these circles to teach with whom. And at the center of the circle, it's me. So I know my secrets, my deepest, darkest secrets. I know all of them. I know everything about myself. And that is, some of that information I'm not going to share. From outside of that, it might be someone's brother. He's my trusted person. The next circle might be parents. The next circle might be school counselor, then maybe teachers, then everybody else and strangers, right? So if you're going to use this to teach inappropriate and appropriate behavior conversations, that's a way to do it. With whom, with where. You might at school from the very center say the very center circle is the counselor's office. This is a place where you can go and share the most information, and you don't have to filter, right? The counselor's office is your safe place, but from there, maybe the classroom only with your teacher. It's only you and the teacher one-on-one. That's another safe place. And then from there, it's the classroom of students. What's the kind of information that we can share in that setting? And then we start talking about hallway, school bus, public settings. So again, working your way from inside the circle out. And the way that TJ and I were teaching this and how we've taught it in the past is actually, again, put it up on the wall. We have Post-it notes, and we have the individuals that we're working with actually interact. So you're really doing some multimodal teaching, interacting with that and having like, so for example, you know, I want to talk about masturbation and my personal preferences with masturbation. You know, am I going to talk about that in the classroom? I'm not going to talk about that in the classroom. When's a more appropriate time to talk about? Probably in the counselor's office. So we're again shaping that behavior, put that nearer to the center of the circle and not on the outside of the circle. So and they do that with the Circles curriculum as well. It actually comes with a huge poster that you put on the wall, and there's a lot of different interactive activities that you're going to do because kids that, you know, are not super verbal need that more physical interactive way to in order to learn, and also in order to demonstrate what they're learning, right? The next slide. So this is a resource, and you'll see this is lgbtmap.org, and it just kind of shares some statistics, and it says an estimated 3 to 5 million LGBTQ people have disabilities. So, and that's something that's another growing area that, again, TJ and I are not trying to address everything in these presentations, but it's also important to understand that there's intersections. And when you, like, let's just talk autism specific, and I think the rate of diagnosis is down to like 1 in what, 33? Is that what it is, guys? I cannot keep up because it keeps changing. But when you have that high of a rate of diagnosis, there is going to be overlap. There's going to be overlap with seizures. There's going to be overlap with, you know, other mental health diagnoses. There's going to be overlap with different religions. There's going to be overlap with different gender preferences and sexuality preferences. So when you have that high of a diagnosis, just make sure that you're digging a lot deeper than a diagnosis. That is just one tiny little aspect of a person as a human, right? If you know what the diversity iceberg is and you understand those different cultural aspects, it's the same thing when it comes to sexuality as well. The next slide is the slide that TJ referred to. I think I'm still handling this one. So this was a training that we went to several years ago. These things are being updated. I saw in the chat that a reference to the diversity narwhal. There's so many different resources out there to help, you know, the layperson just understand it. Huh?
We'll have to add the narwhal in.
I like narwhals, but again, like this is to help individuals that don't have this knowledge understand and apply it, right? So it's really nice to have these. So please feel free to use these. I know they're being updated all the time. So if this is not the most up to date, if you want to share one with me, please feel free to. But I know it was really helpful for me when I was first getting into understanding gender identity versus expression versus assigned sex and things like that. It was really helpful to me. So please feel free to use it and share it. You can go on to the next. And then here's some of those.
I have a question too. I mean, well, obviously I have a bunch of questions, and some of it is about like aromanticism and agenderism and also asexuality, which I know even within the disability community, because of how things have been sort of linked, has its own controversy. But then also like pansexuality and like also how to have safety if you choose that and you have partners who choose that. And I know that's a big discussion just in general communities of how to, if you feel comfortable with and you're okay with other people, multiple partners, and how to do that safely in some ways. And I know that's one of the tough things because we tend to, sometimes when we have one group, we want to make sure that we're doing it in the safest way possible that's sort of known, and that feels more unsafe just even with the general society. But being open, thinking about that in the future, not saying that it should be done without some of the other considerations that have already been talked about.
This has evolved so much in just a short period of time. I mean, you know, when my daughter was going through middle school and high school, what was allowable and what was acceptable and what kids were able to express confidently is so much different than when I was even in high school, right? So, I mean, I had friends in high school that I was pretty sure that they were not attracted to people of the opposite sex, and they weren't expressing that and they weren't sharing that. It didn't feel like a safe space. So we're creating a world that is safer, not just for disability, but also for sexuality and gender expression and whatnot. So that's going to continue to evolve in these trainings, the education available, everything's going to evolve with it. And it has. I mean, that's what I have observed. I mean, nobody was doing this training 10 years ago. That's why TJ and I were asked to do it. And that's changed. We've got Planned Parenthood. We've got YWCA. There's so many places that are stepping up to the table to provide this kind of support.
Yeah, two other quick comments on this. One would be that it feels like, my son is 16, he's a sophomore, and it's so like refreshing, I guess is the right word. Like all this kind of stuff, it's just like a non-issue. It's just who a person is. And he's on his school's academic team, and they just took a weekend trip down to Louisville. And before he was leaving, he was like, I was thinking about it. He's like, I think I'm the only like straight person that's going on this trip. Because that one he said he's bisexual and we know he's gay, but like it didn't matter. You know what I mean? It was just this group of kids, and that's just who they are. And it's such like I don't want to minimize it, but it's almost like it's kind of just a non-issue for him. He's just so comfortable with it. It's just, that's just who they are. And it's like for me, like such a breath of fresh air. Because again, when I went through school, and I went through Catholic school, there weren't any gay kids in our class,
No.
Well, and at least until they felt like they were safe and able to express themselves, So I feel like this is changing much for the positive. And the other point I'm going to make to this, and I'm going to try to be delicate here, maybe not.
Can't wait.
I think we all really have to understand the political implications of things that are going on around this. And this is where people need to advocate, and this is where people need to speak up. And if it doesn't impact you personally, it may impact people you work with professionally or colleagues or friends. You think about that. And again, I'm going to get a little political, and I apologize if I offend anyone, but you think about that terribly backward kind of bill in Florida where they're not allowed to talk about they're not even able to use the word gay in schools and things like that. That's just such a giant backwards, step that I think there is a real role for people to advocate and vote and express yourself and all of that around these issues, because there are so many people that have such opposition and lack of comfort around this, that their response is to put these kind of just ridiculous rules in place. And I do think there's a role for those of us who support people with such a range of needs to remember that and to advocate as best we can. So I'll get off that soapbox a little bit, but that's a real pet peeve of mine.
No, I think it's important because you can see an intersection. I mean, just reading a report, and AUCD is doing something about the high rate of autistic people and still being number one leading of suicide. And there's a huge correlation with autistic people, myself included, being in some ways part of the LGBT community, not just because of some of the social constructs around that and how you identify as maybe not heteronormative and so, I mean, even thinking about how that still happens for transgender youth and for LGBT, I mean, these things have real world implications and
right.
that could be devastating for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Sorry, not to.
Nope. Thank you. We're on the same soapbox about that, Jason.
So this last resource is just sexuality assessment, just a couple of examples of assessments that can be used that assess knowledge and attitudes and experience. Again, this is just a way, and these are more professional resources. Typically, parents are going to use these or purchase these, are more expensive. You're going to go to, your psychologist, you're going to go to your therapist and ask them if they can access or know of someone who has access to them to be able to have this knowledge of even where to start when it comes to knowledge. And then
I think in a few minutes, sorry, Amanda, just in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about some of these things, not necessarily these specific scales, but I'm going to get a little bit more into like some of the stuff that I've been involved in professionally that involves some of this. So we'll kind of come back to this a little bit. What else were you going to say? Sorry.
No, that's fine. The next things we're gonna talk about are social media, and then we're gonna get into safety, touch upon some things like consent and things like that, and then we're gonna wrap up. So we're gonna try to breeze through these next slides so we leave time for questions and answers to everybody, okay?
Thank you for that prompt, Amanda. That was a prompt to me to breeze through these slides, right? Okay, so most popular social media platforms in 2021. So it's just, this is percentage of adults, but it is important to understand that kids, adolescents are obviously using these things all the time, probably more so than adults, and it's very common. And this is the way that a lot of people interact anymore. And it's important for us as professionals, and also as parents, to understand what these things are, how these things work, if possible, so that you can have a better sense of what's going on with your son or daughter or people you're supporting. These are just the most popular. There's obviously a ton more social media things, and this changes all the time too. Other forms, and this, I think it's important just to keep in mind other things that can be considered social media. A lot of video games are played online, and there are chat and interactive components to those. It's not a traditional social media app, but they are ways that people can be social and interact with each other through some of these things. So video games, mobile games, obviously things like YouTube, FaceTime, messaging apps, stuff like that.
It's also a way for people to be taken advantage of and bullied. So, and this is why it's important for everyone to be aware of this, that this can be considered social media because it happens on a regular basis, that things are occurring in the comment boxes, or they're occurring, when they're playing those virtual video games in a group. And it's very important for us to be aware of that when we're supporting individuals.
So there are some things that are not considered social media, things like assistive devices, just watching TV, things where there aren't that back and forth opportunity. So again, not all video games are played online. Not all of them have that chat or interactive feature. So there are certainly things that don't have that back and forth that are a little bit different. So it's important to understand, again, broadly, that social media, there are two types of social media use. There's active use, which is just like it sounds. You're sharing, you're creating, you're engaging, you're commenting, you're liking, you're whatever, on a regular basis. Amanda is an active user of social media. Then there are passive users of social media. That would be me. Rarely do I create much or engage a whole lot. I just kind of observe. I'm just more passive.
Recently, I don't know what happened recently. You had like 2 posts in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Well, you had 2 posts in the last month. You're blowing me away, man.
I'm trying to,
get outside your comfort zone, be more social.
Yeah.
Okay.
So passive social media use is most common, right? So those of us who are more passive in their social media use, but there really can be some problems with that. It can be associated with higher levels of anxiety and depression. And a lot of that comes from that comparison that you do when you're looking at things on social media. I'm looking at pictures of this great trip that Amanda just took down to New Orleans, and I'm all sad because I'm just sitting here at home and I can't, I didn't get to go on that fun trip and all that kind of stuff.
I didn't invite you. Comparison is a thief of joy, TJ.
But again, so social media, there are different ways that people use it, and if you are supporting someone or know someone who is really just passively using this stuff, it might be something to have a conversation about, because it could be the source of some frustration or some anxiety and things like that. So it's important to know there are those different ways of interacting with this stuff.
I've learned that more, and I think the kids on the main campus have more of a social media presence, there just is a lot of conflict that they bring in with them every single day. From those social media interactions, and there's fights that are happening because of what happened last night on social media, so it's something that we definitely need to be aware of, especially, we need to make sure that other people are also aware of this. Maybe people that are not active social media users, maybe people that, grew up at a different time when there wasn't a lot of social media, because they're not considering that when they're interacting with these youth and these young adults in their day-to-day their just day-to-day activities. It really impacts them in how their day goes. And I've watched it happen with my daughter. I've tried to get her to stop. I tried to get her to hang it up. I tried to get her to, and she finally got to the point where she was starting to self-monitor, and she was starting to, like, I can't remember what the term is, but she got rid of her Facebook account and her Instagram account for a while. No, she got rid of her Instagram and Snapchat account, because Facebook is for old people, according to her. So she got rid of those for a while because she was finding herself accessing it, and she was comparing herself constantly to what these girls look like and what these kids have access to in their cars and their houses and this and that. And it really is, comparison is the thief of joy. It was impacting her, self-assessment of herself, how well she was doing, how successful she was doing, how happy she was. Like, it's really something that bleeds over into day-to-day functioning.
So we're just going to go through these really quickly. There's some kind of pros and cons of social media use. And this is, it could be for anybody, I suppose, but these are things that are more specific in terms of pros to people with developmental disabilities. Sometimes interacting with people through social media takes away some of that nonverbal, subtle social stuff. So there's less of that to kind of interpret in some situations. And it can be a way for people to connect. And so there's research about adolescents on the autism spectrum that they can have better quality friendships, better quantity friendships, if they're using these things, because again, it takes away some of those obstacles that people have to face-to-face communication. So it's not to say that it's in place of or anything like that, but there can be some positives to using social media for people with developmental disabilities.
You can also meet more people that have the specific interests that you have. It's easier to find those groups, and you're not just limited to your social group at school, or if you're not even at school, right? If you're being homeschooled on home instruction, you can find people with those similar interests. So my daughter had, and this again, I've heard parents freaking out about this, but I know my daughter had friends with kids that were out of state, and that has been a great benefit to her. I mean, she's really maintained those relationships over the years, and it's not a bad thing, as long as it's being monitored and she's engaging in safe behavior, right?
Yeah, so my son, just to use a quick example, he's, like I said, he's 16, and when he transferred schools between middle school and high school. So he had gone all through school up through middle school with the group of kids in one school district, and then he transferred to a different high school because we moved. So, but what has happened is through social media, he has actually, and it really is him, he has actually brought these two groups of students together. It's been really pretty cool. His group of friends, like from elementary and middle school, and his group of friends from high school, and they all connect. They spend every evening, they're on Discord in this large group chat while they're watching videos on YouTube and talking, and somebody's streaming a video game and all that kind of stuff. But they also do get together in real life, fortunately. They go outside sometimes and things, but it's been a cool opportunity for him, and it's been really neat to see that he's been kind of the catalyst for this. But it's been through the social media that he's kind of brought these two groups together, and it's pretty neat. Again, like when I think about myself in high school, I didn't really interact with people from other high schools. I didn't like those people. They were other, but through these opportunities, he's been able to really create this larger network. It's been pretty cool. So again, with some other potential pros, sometimes there are more distinct or limited reactions that you can have to things. So, I know not too long ago, well, it's probably a couple of years ago now, the Facebook just used to have like the thumbs up, thumbs down or something. Right now they've got a larger variety of options and things like that. But again, it takes stuff that's really gray and gives you a handful of black and white options that you can say, okay, yes, I have seen this, I acknowledge this. And there is the benefit, and this is a benefit that I don't think enough people take advantage of. You can actually review and edit what you post on social media before you do
or
that.
delete it. Yeah. I mean, if it's really not appropriate.
Even not post it. Yeah. That again, that might be another thing that gets into the political realm, that you can actually.
Yeah, it's again one of those things where we're like saying, people with developmental disabilities need to be careful about what they post on social media. And I'm just like, everybody needs to be careful what they post on social media.
Absolutely.
And yeah, so.
Yeah. Again, some more benefits. It is, you can kind of see the logical progression of a conversation if you're part of a group or something, and you can kind of watch in a way through that passive social media use. You can learn the expectations or the norms of a group. Amanda mentioned before the opportunities for shared interests and things, and there has been research where professionals have used social media interactions as ways to learn more about the experiences of people with disabilities. So there's some positives to those things. There are obviously cons. We'll talk a lot more about some of these things, but if you're always passive, like we talked about, that can lead to feelings of isolation. There's obviously issues with scams, and that's a whole separate topic around safety related to those things. It included this in here just as an interesting kind of fact, but in the DSM-5, which is going to be revised here relatively soon, under those conditions for further research that are kind of tucked into the back, there's internet gaming disorder, something that is being considered as a potential DSM diagnosis. So I haven't kept up with that to know whether that's something that's still being considered or not, but it was at least something that was under study. So I think why don't we go kind of quickly, Amanda, through some of these since it's 2:30.
I got to think in there. This is great. There's some great resources in these next slides.
Yep. So this one, Touchpoint, is a great resource. This is one example of the things they have. If you look down on the side of the screen there, there's a lot of different disability topics and things that they have here. And this isn't just a social media site or a disability site. It's a much broader site, but there's a lot of really good resources on here. So through Touchpoint, and we will go through some of these pretty quickly, but 12 ways to improve social media and online communication. And like Amanda said, the reality is this is not disability. This is actually, I don't think this is even for disability. This is for everybody. So again, we all could do a better job at this. I think we won't ask for a show of hands, but we go through this, think about how many of these you're guilty of yourself. Probably all of us have done most of these things at one time or another, but it's good as a general guideline, and especially as kind of a teaching strategy to be aware of these things. So try to keep work and life separate on social media if possible. Not adding your boss or your friend, your teachers or things like that. That can lead to some role confusion and things like that. Don't comment about work. I mean, you guys know this by now, but anytime anybody does, you send them a job application, they're going to be looking at all of your social media before they call you about an interview. So you got to know that people are looking at that stuff. So try not to post things that might skew their opinions. If you are going to meet someone in real life that you only know online, think about the safety around that. Where, when, who's with you, all that kind of thing. Keep your password safe. I'm reminded of my mother-in-law who has a little book with all of her passwords. It says like passwords on the cover, which real subtle. So don't believe everything you read online. Again, try not to get too political here, but particularly social media. Don't believe everything that you read online. And again, that can be a challenge for some people with disabilities who don't maybe struggle to understand the motivations of others or kind of some of that subtle stuff that goes behind some of what gets posted. Try not to compare your life with others' lives. Again, Amanda took that trip to New Orleans and I didn't get to go. Now I've gotten over that, but she still hasn't invited me. So always be polite. Try to avoid arguments. The whole thing about typing in all caps is the digital equivalent of yelling. Use emojis, use those visual kind of things to better express yourself. Sometimes that's enough as a response, as a way to express yourself. Mm-hmm. Don't forget, you can step away. You can block people. You can report people. There are things like that you can do if you are in situations where you're really uncomfortable. And then obviously don't ever send explicit photographs. Don't do that. That never ends well. So again, just general tips for everybody, but also really important tips when we're working on these things with people with disabilities.
So the next slides are safety. And again, we're going to go through these just like everything else. This is a great resource. We're going to go through pretty quickly. I want to leave time for Q&A, and I hope we do have some Q&A. Dave
We go till
Hinsberger
3,
is,
right? I meant to ask that. We go till 3?
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah, 3. Dave Hinsberger was a great advocate for the community and a great educator. He's the one who brought a lot of the sex education and, more importantly, diversity in terms of sexuality to the forefront as the intersection with disability. So he was a huge advocate for that, taught a lot about it. And one of the things that he created was this graphic. So if you want to know more about Dave, please look him up. He just passed away last year, but he was a huge advocate for the community and making sure that, you know, people with disabilities were seen as sexual beings, capable sexual beings that deserved love, and that this was a natural thing for everyone and not just for people who fit a specific criteria. So the things that are needed in order to create a safe person, any safe person, all right? So here are the things in the circle is we need someone who listens. We need an understanding of personal rights. We need a healthy self-concept and self-confidence. And we know typical people who don't have this are more likely to be in an abusive relationship. They're more likely to be abused. So important. Options for healthy sexuality. So the example of this is, you know, I've had parents over the years ask me how to get their kid to stop masturbating, and that, you know, he doesn't masturbate. No one in my family masturbates, and not giving that person options. And it's just like a dam, you stick your finger in it and the water's going to come out somewhere else. So we have to have those options. Dave Hinsberger, just so you know, TJ, I don't know if you knew this, he's the one who created those videos to teach people how to masturbate. So there's 2 videos, they're in our resources.
Yeah.
I know it's one of those things you're like, this is really uncomfortable, but you know, for a lot of our kids, like, it's not something that we just do this trial and error. Like a lot of us, typical people, it's trial and error, or through our sexual relationships with other people that we understand what brings us pleasure and understands how to give ourselves out of that pleasure. If you haven't had a relationship with another person, if you haven't had those experiences, it's really hard to understand how to masturbate. That is an option for healthy sexuality, right? Sex education, again, we could do a whole training on masturbation. Privacy awareness. And then, Jason, to your point, and this is an important one, the ability and the option to non-comply. If you have these skills, then you can, you know, you've got more skills that are keep you safe, and it's going to keep those abusive people away. So let's go down to the next slide. So here's the myth. We reordered these slides because I just want to make it really clear. There's a myth in stranger danger. We've talked about this for years and years and years and years. And unfortunately, the great majority of abuse is perpetrated by people we know. It is not perpetrated by strangers. 94% are people the victim already knows. And it's so really important for us to start really reframing that when we are teaching any kid, every single person, because we need to start teaching them how to say no. We need to teach them how to be non-compliant in those situations around care, safety, and welfare. So here's a couple of tools for it. Safety and body rights. This is something that it's important for us to know that this goes both ways. We need to teach it like a mantra on a regular basis. TJ and I, when we were teaching, again, at Down Syndrome Association, we did this every single class. And I guarantee that if we went back, a lot of the kids that were not kids, adults that were in that class would need a refresher on this, just based on the experience that we had. We went over it every single time. We did fill in the blank. We did, repetition. We did echo. We did multiple choice. And we tried to do this in a lot of different ways. But the safety and the body rights, this is so important to teach. And again, my body belongs to me. That also means that TJ's body belongs to him. That means that just like I don't want you to touch me without my permission, I should not be touching anyone else without their permission as well. So important to teach that two-way street there. There's actually a whole entire curriculum in the next slide, TJ, in the DUBY curriculum that talks about how to avoid sexual predators and how to reduce the risk of being the victim of a sexual crime. But on the other side of it, and TJ unfortunately has experience with this, is how to avoid being identified as a sexual predator. And what to do if you find yourself in that situation where someone's accusing you of doing something that they're uncomfortable with. So TJ, I know you typically will share an example here.
Well, yeah, and fortunately or unfortunately, as it were, I was as recently as like a day or two ago, I was telling Amanda I wasn't sure I was going to be able to be here for this presentation. So at this point, probably tomorrow, I'm actually going to be testifying in a court case. One of the things that's come my way several times through Hamilton County DD Services is I've been asked by detectives, investigators, prosecutors to conduct an assessment of a person with disability, of their ability to consent to sexual activity. And that is a very interesting, very dynamic question that unfortunately is not very well grounded in law or clinical research. There is some, but there is not necessarily a, well, you ask these questions or you give this test and then you can say yes or no, this person can consent to sexual activity. So going back to the slide a few slides ago where there was the list of resources of the specific assessments, using things like those assessments, that's what I've done in these situations. And so again, my examples are the ones where things go wrong. The case that I'm going to be testifying in tomorrow, a young woman, early 30s, with developmental disabilities, not an intellectual disability, cerebral palsy, ADHD, a couple of things, but not an intellectual disability, was sexually abused over a period of a couple of years by a male nurse who was coming into her family home to provide services to her disabled siblings. So she's part of a family who had adopted 5 or 6 kids with multiple disabilities. Great family, do the world for these kids. And so this caregiver was coming in to provide support for the other siblings and started having a sexual relationship with this woman. So, and it happened for quite some time before it was discovered. So I did this assessment of her. My opinion, based on some of these assessment tools and interview and a bunch of other things, is that she does not have the ability to consent. She doesn't have the capacity to consent to sexual behavior. And I say that because, going back to some of the other topics we talked about, she never had sex education in school. So she didn't understand a lot of terminology. She had a basic understanding of biology, like these parts are named these things, but didn't really understand the physiology part of it. You know, this is yes, women have periods, but she didn't know why or what that meant, or she didn't know anything about contraception or protection or pregnancy. There were a whole bunch of concepts that we talked about earlier in this presentation that she had just never had any exposure to. So she essentially, my opinion is that she's not able to consent to sexual activity. So using that opinion and other information, obviously they've moved forward with charging this guy with, I don't think he's actually charged with rape. I think he's charged with, oh, I can't even recall right now. That's terrible. But he's essentially repeated sexual assaults of this girl over a period of time. And so it's gone to trial. I mean, I have, this is the 6th one of these assessments I've done over the last few years. This is the first time one of these has gone to trial. I think in most cases, people will get the results of these assessments and kind of hear the details and the facts of these situations and say, oh, there's no way, that's terrible. Either we'll take a plea deal or something like that. But for whatever reason, this defense attorney is deciding they're going to fight this issue and blah, blah. So again, I won't belabor that any more than I already have, but these situations when the education and the training and the knowledge is not there, it can go very poorly. Again, it's not always going to end up in such a serious situation as this, but this stuff happens and it's real and it's happening now. I actually just last week got another referral to do the same kind of assessment again for another situation that was just discovered. So it's unfortunate and it's awful. And again, I think it really always highlights to me the importance of doing exactly what we're doing. We have to teach this stuff. We have to teach. Again, this woman didn't feel like she could tell anybody. She didn't feel like she had much of a choice. He was very coercive. He threatened her siblings if she didn't comply with some of these things. So there were all these factors in place that, again, I'm not saying that good sex education would have prevented this from happening, but she didn't really have the tools that would have helped her navigate those things in a more successful way. Again, if you have someone who is intent on acting towards someone in a sexual way, this guy who, in my opinion, is a sexual predator, being able to say no, that's usually not sufficient. She's told this guy no all the time, but it still happened. Again, a potential sexual predator is unlikely to hear somebody say no and then say, oh, well, thank you, I respect your wishes, I will withdraw my intent to sexually assault you now because you expressed your wishes. We need to teach more than just saying no. We need to teach how to report, how to self-advocate. Gosh, even things like self-defense. I'm not suggesting we want to teach people to fight, but maybe, again, it might give other options. So I will stop and we'll move on with this. But again, I just think it's a real world situation and examples of how this stuff can go really badly when you don't have all of this stuff. So again, not to make it a horror story or scare everybody, but it does happen. And we also do serve people who have been labeled as sexual predators. There are people with developmental disabilities that we serve who live in Hamilton County who have raped people, sexually assaulted people. It does happen. And sometimes that can be a result of lack of some of this stuff too, lack of education, lack of knowledge, lack of boundaries, all that kind of stuff. In some cases, there are other factors, mental illness and stuff that play in, but these things are real and really do happen. So it's important that we're aware of that. And as much as we like to not think about those things, the reality is, unfortunately, there's probably somebody being sexually assaulted in Cincinnati right now, and we may not know about it. Reporting rates are low in the general population for sexual abuse. They're much, much lower for people with disabilities. So, okay, I'm going to jump off my soapbox, but I think it's important to have that kind of perspective on some of this stuff.
Thank you, TJ. And I want to skip forward a couple slides just because we're running out of time, and I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A. So again, like with safety, that's fine right there. So if you want to go back to one, actually, so when we're making sure that we're safe, we need to establish boundaries when we're talking about our preferences, being very specific. When you're trying to, develop a relationship with anyone whatsoever, right? If someone's touching you in the way that you don't like, then you need to tell them that you don't like to be touched that way, or you don't want to be touched that way. But, you can't just sit back. So when you're forming a relationship, making sure that you're identifying your sensory preferences, your triggers, any other unique needs and specific, and that is going to create a safe relationship, right? Just because, so, we've talked about this before, there's a lot of different preferences, right? There's a lot of different preferences that we have sexually. We can't assume that somebody likes to have, romantic, soft sex, right? Like, you need to have those conversations. There's people that, unfortunately have learned most of their sexual knowledge through porn. That is not a lot of times a realistic image of what happens in the bedroom. And it's really important that we have those conversations. If you're going to have a safe relationship with someone, you're going to have those conversations with them. I do not like it when someone pulls my hair. I do not like it when someone, shoves their tongue down my throat. I don't like to kiss that way. It's important because if you don't have those conversations and you don't say those things, and assumptions are made, or people just kind of barrel through the next thing. So go ahead and go to the next one. So the consent slide, this is just one of so many options. Thankfully, a lot of different resources are out there around consent, but this is the FRIES acronym, all right? So consent needs to be freely given, all right? There's no quid pro quo. We're not trying to get other people to talk them into doing things that they don't want to do if there's hesitancy. What's also important, and again, I talked to college kids about this, it's reversible. You can tell your boyfriend today that this is a big night and we're going to have sex tonight. And I'm so excited and I can't wait to have sex with you. And you are allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to be in the bedroom with all of your clothes off in the middle of a heavy makeout session and say, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. I need a break. I don't want to do this right now. You are allowed to do that. Every single person on this call is allowed to do it. I don't care what your diagnosis is. It is reversible. You're allowed to change your mind. And a lot of people don't know this. They feel like I've already signed up for it. I already, made the big plans. I already said, this was the big night. So that's not true. Inform to TJ, talked to it pretty comprehensively about what an informed choice is. So making sure that it's an informed choice. So if I say I'm going to go out with my boyfriend tonight and we're going all the way, do I have the same idea of what going all the way is as he does? Like making sure we're on the same page, enthusiastic. Sure, we're going to be nervous. The first time you have sex, the first time you interact with someone, in a romantic way, you're going to be nervous, and that's okay. But you still can be enthusiastic and enthusiastically nervous or nervously enthusiastic. But whatever you're doing or the person should be doing should be because they really want to and they're excited to do it. And also it's specific. So I don't start having sex with someone and then say, oh, by the way, I'm going to, we're having anal sex tonight, and like suddenly try to slip that in on somebody. It needs to be specific. It needs to be agreed upon. People need to know what they're getting into, or else it is not those things. It is not consensual. Does that make sense? So those are the things that I'm saying. And a lot of times what happens, especially if you're unfamiliar in the area of sexual or romantic interactions, you are interacting with someone who might have more experience. And what happens is people get taken advantage of and they go further than they expected to go. They just wanted a kiss. They never had a kiss before. And the next thing they know, they've been taken advantage of because there wasn't a specific conversation or interaction around this. So just some important concepts. I think somebody put some links. Another really popular resource, one resource is the T video. There's lots and lots of different videos out there that I want to just Google. But that is a whole entire training. And there's more things that we can talk about with that. So with consent, when you're working with younger kids, just make sure that it is not black and white. Talk about choice. Give them choice as young as possible. If your kid wants to wear green pants with an orange shirt, it's not the end of the world. Just let them wear the damn green pants with an orange shirt. It doesn't matter if it doesn't match, okay? Give them some choice. Empower them. Make them feel like they have choice so that in the future, they make choices and they make safe choices. So we have talked about over-compliance with this. It's so important to make sure that what we're teaching to our kids is choice and not necessarily teaching them that they have to obey adults no matter what. And why is that? Because we already learned the myth of stranger danger, right? So it's not us. You may know you're a safe person. I know I'm a safe person, but I don't know if this other person is a safe person. So we have to prepare our kids for those unknowns. So making sure that we're teaching compliance when it's appropriate, when it's an issue of care and safety and welfare. Do not run into the road. Do not run into the highway. Identify what the non-negotiables are, and then let some other things go. Okay, just let some other things go. So that's what I would say, but I think we're getting better at that as well. Here's some additional thoughts on safety. So consider including education on the implications of turning 18 as it relates to behaviors and activities. Very important to do. Instead of good and bad, which places a subjective judgment on thoughts and behaviors, focus more on objective concepts such as safe and dangerous, private and public. It's really important to think about safety in a practical manner. So how does a person use public transportation without talking to a stranger? If something happens in the community and all that person sees is a stranger, how do they ask for help if we taught them that they shouldn't interact with strangers? So be very practical when it comes to that. And then some other additional thoughts is, again, and this is one that we have to stress with families on a regular basis, you are not immortal. Parents are not immortal. I wish that you could be. I wish you could always be there for your kid. But if you are setting everything up based on you being the one who's the trusted person and you're the one who's ensuring the safety, you're setting up that individual for tragedy, unfortunately, something that could be very difficult. Expand that circle. Make sure that you have a backup plan. When my daughter was a teenager and really going through some tough times, she didn't want to talk to me. She hated me. She told me on a regular basis. It's a hard thing to hear. It's just a natural part of development sometimes. Unfortunately, I did it. I look back on my teenage years. My parents have, laughed at me. We've laughed together about all these things. But, she started contacting a really close friend of mine. and reaching out to her to ask about certain things, because she had realized that a close friend of mine had scars all over her arms, right? And engaged in self-injurious behavior. And she could see that this is not a perfect adult. And she saw me as like somebody who was expecting perfection, right? And reaching out to her and talking to her and sharing her frustrations and asking for advice. And finally, the friend contacted me and she was like, I hope you know your daughter's been contacting me. And she's been letting me know. I said, I just want to stop you right there. I said, if it's not an issue of her safety or the safety of somebody else, thank you. Thanks for being there. Thanks for being somebody she can talk to. I still get emotional. Look at this. So many years later, it still makes me emotional, but it's so powerful to have someone that is not you, that your kid can talk to, and knowing that that person is going to watch out for them after you're gone or when you're not there or when you can't be there is a very powerful tool, and one that I would encourage every family to make sure that they start planning for. The earlier, the better. So making sure that families have that. And then our favorite slide is the next slide, TJ. We like to show this one a lot. Once again, another example of the boundaries and the circles and how we teach those different skills. But I want to move on because we have 5 minutes left.
Yeah,
TJ.
we have 5 minutes. So I think what we'll do, the
very last.
We'll
the
skip
next.
the cartoon here.
Yes.
The concept of dignity of risk is kind of what we've talked about already. We got to let people try things and experience things and have some failures and learn from them. So I'll let you read this. But the reality is that's how all of us learn, is we do things and we screw them up, and then we learn and do it differently the next time. And that's not often an opportunity that we give a lot of people with disabilities. So, okay, that's a whole lot of stuff. And I'll just to skim through here, there's slides here at the end. That's just for you guys to have some other options and resources. So I'm going to stop sharing. And then I know there's stuff going on in the chat. I haven't really been able to see it while I was talking, or sharing the slides. So
I feel like we addressed a lot. James had brought up something and I responded. So James, if you want to talk about that. And then there's a question. This one's a pretty big question. So Sarah shared that an area that she's been navigating more and more doing care management is youth with developmental delays, desiring to pursue hormone blockers or even surgeries, and then parent hesitations and concerns with the youth with delays wouldn't be able to make a decision like this. What can we do to assist in educating families on those issues, to have more knowledge and to understand more? What a big old question. So, and I mean, I feel like I'm going to demonstrate some bias when I share this. So I'm just going to give that. And if you disagree with me, I would welcome the opportunity to have the conversation. But one of the things that I've noticed anecdotally throughout the years is that some of the youth that I work with who have developmental delays, actual developmental delays, they delay their experience of adolescence, that boundary pushing. All of those things may push back a little bit later. So with some of the kids that I've worked with, they're the super compliant kids until they're like 16 or 17, and suddenly the crap is hitting the fan and they're pushing back and whatnot. The same thing with the exploration of sexuality. I've worked with a lot of people, a lot of adults over the years that don't really start to explore their sexuality until they're in their 20s, sometimes even their 30s and 40s, just because that wasn't what was on their mind when they were a teenager, right? Or wasn't what was on their mind and even in their 20s. So the first thing that I would do is that I would just make sure that we're really exploring how long has this been going on? How long have we been talking about this? What are the other, demonstrated signs? Because what I've seen, again, anecdotally, with my daughter, with her friends running a school setting for years, is that there's a period of exploration. We need to allow that period of exploration. Make sure that you allow a safe space for someone to explore, right? Their sexuality, their gender identity, and things like that. So that's the first step. Has someone fully explored it? Do they feel like it's been supported, that exploration? Because what I've noticed is that we've got kids that they want to identify as a male when they're in junior high. And then that once again shifts back to identifying as female when they're in high school. And then what I've noticed is that it's a little bit of both. For some individuals, it's just a case example, right? But I just noticed that it's not that black and white. So we want to make sure that when someone is exploring the sexuality, they have a safe environment to do it. We're not doing anything that's super permanent, so that they have the ability to safely explore it and they haven't made a permanent decision. With that being said, parents and kids disagree all the time. And if there's one area, parents have a really hard time with sexuality and gender identity. They just do. It's the same thing like here, at the school when we're in IEP meetings, the kids like, I want to move out of state when I grow up. And the parents are like, that's not happening. I mean, first of all, it's insulting. It's insulting to anybody if someone just laughs at your dreams and your goals, but there's a difference on a regular basis. It comes from a place of love and care a lot of times. But there is going to be a difference. And sometimes what happens a lot of times is that kid just has to turn 18 and they have to become an adult and they start making those decisions and doing those things on their own. There are the LGBTQ clinic at Children's Hospital I know can help people navigate these conversations. We also have some resources out in the community where we have therapists that are more comfortable with the LGBT community and just that the evolution of that community and how to support families and kids. But TJ, do you have anything to add to that?
Just kind of looking at the screen and thinking about the fact that, the majority of you guys, unless I'm totally misunderstanding the audience, are professionals in training and developing and all of that. And I do think it's important that you understand where you stand on some of these things, because there's such a mess of personal and spiritual and moral and all this other stuff that gets really tangled up in this. And I think we really have to remember, I'm the one saying this knowing that I was getting political and all that before, but I think that we really have to remember that our sort of role is to provide factual information to people and help them reach decisions. And that this general topic of sexuality and gender identity and all that is not comfortable for some people to talk about. And if for you as a professional, it's not comfortable to talk about, be honest about that. I would much rather hear that you hear somebody say, I understand your questions. I don't think I'm the right person to answer them, but let's find somebody who can. So, and if you are that person, fantastic. But if you're not, don't force it. I really think these issues are so loaded in so many ways that doing that kind of self-exploration as you kind of get into these professional fields is really important. So again, just thinking about if you're the person to have those conversations, great. If you're not, that's okay. And be okay with that and be okay with sharing resources and things like that. So I don't know if that helps kind of answer that or not, but there are so many things that intersect here. And anything related to sexuality, in your Venn diagram, there's just overlapping, circles of everything here. So, and not everybody's comfortable working right?
We're still developing the precedent with all of this. So there's not a lot of things to compare to. There's not a lot of professionals who've gone through exactly the same situation or a variety of different of situations to be able to provide that guidance. So, but there are resources in the Cincinnati area. Like TJ said, I would just reach out to those and try to find it. Yeah, we are late. So it's 3:02. James, did we do an okay job? I know you had brought up something about the assessment. And using familiar language in assessment is absolutely, you're right. That is absolutely important if you're going to get, the most accurate information from the person that you're assessing. You can't use unfamiliar language or they're not going to know what you're talking about, right? So
the last plug I'll make just real quick, because I know people are jumping off and that's fine if you need to go. If you have other follow-up questions for us or things that we didn't get to, or you want to ask other specific things, I know that Dr. Smith and Dr. Weber have our email addresses and know how to contact us, and that's perfectly fine. I think I'll speak for Amanda, but we're good getting questions from people outside of this if you have them.
It rarely happens, so please surprise us. Send us an email. Everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you for so much of your time. Thanks for dealing with us, dealing with the online format.
It was a lot to get through. We appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Bye, everybody.
TJ, do you have a second, TJ?
Yep.
Great. Bye. Bye, everybody. Have a great day. Hopefully that wasn't boring, everybody. I cannot remember. Well, once again, we got to the end. So 2 hours we know is not going to be long enough for every slide on this presentation, huh?
Yeah, I know.
I feel like we skipped the same ones on a regular basis, so too.
Yeah, I agree. Because I do want to leave more time for conversation than we tend to have.
Yeah, I mean, the question that she asked, that's a huge question. I'm like,
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you for looking at the chat because I really couldn't see it when I was sharing my screen. So thank you for doing that.
no, I feel like I addressed everything. I mean,
Oh, hold on. I'm going to stop recording. How about that?
it's a great idea.